It's a great pleasure to be here again. And I'll begin immediately since we're running a little late. This talk explores the mediatic trope known as immersion, being in the picture, via a tendency in films about Vincent van Gogh to blur the boundary between pictorial diegetic space and the space of the spectator, between image space and body space. It concludes with a few words on Agnès Varda's deliberate undermining of tableau vivant as an immersive practice. I'd like to begin by recalling to mind a few pre-cinematic forms of immersive experience, beginning with the programmed walk through the English landscape garden. 18th and 19th century spectators repeatedly enjoyed the frisson of aestheticized spaces, of entering them in tableau vivant, of turning the landscape into painting with the help of clawed glasses or mirrors used as optical toys, and of simulating landscape by way of painting, as in the panorama. Even camera obscura effects are understood as immersive in 18th century England. Recall Joseph Addison's description of his experience in a dark room in the Spectator papers. Here he describes moving images in true colors projected on two opposing walls between which Addison describes himself as being positioned, immersed in images that intermingle art and nature. Like that of many a picturesque traveler, the discursive framework of Addison's experience is shaped by the desire to see nature as art. Similarly, in his Salon, Denis Diderot projects himself into the genre paintings he describes by using the fiction of physically entering the painting. In such instances, Diderot's descriptions narrativize the paintings he describes, enters, and inhabits, turning them into spaces replete with sounds, breezes, and even odors. Then in the 1780s through the 1880s, there is the panorama, which aims at the figured placement of the spectator within the represented scene, again as a means of blurring the boundaries between reality and art. The influence of the panorama is also visible in the paintings of this period that abandoned traditional framing and compositional devices, such as Caspar David Friedrich's Monk by the Sea. Now let's see if I can, which I was fortunate to see in Berlin a couple of days ago. Of particular interest is this painting's effect on one viewer, Heinrich von Kleist, who describes his visual and bodily experience of immersion into its images in a review titled Feelings Before Friedrich's Seascape. Kleist writes, "The picture with its 2 or 3 mysterious objects lies before one like the apocalypse, as though it were thinking Jung's night thoughts, and since in its uniformity and boundlessness it has no foreground but the frame of the picture, literal frame, the viewer feels as though his eyelids had been cut off." Kleist is plunged, in other words, too abruptly into the picture's world. His remark strongly conveys the physical and material aspects of spectatorial experience, conveys the momentous impact the mere abandoning of conventional framing devices could have on the beholder of a painted landscape during this period. As Oliver Grau points out, spectatorial practices promoted by the panorama are at play here, and Kleist's notion of the ideal observer's position is in the image. I don't intend to suggest that a conventional genealogy links immersive practices in the England, France, and Germany of the 18th and 19th century. It isn't proto-cinematic experience that is at issue here either. Of interest to me is that as spectators, we repeatedly seek out such experiences, each in its historically specific context, with its historically specific technologies, yes, but each with its distinctive physiological and psychological component. Each with its distinctly physiological and psychological component. The varieties of immersive practices are historically specific but share commonalities as well as difference. What is immersion's pull? Are immersive experiences simply fairground attraction, given different guises in different epochs? And what about the political implications of immersion? Walter Benjamin famously disdains the legendary Chinese painter Wu Daozi, who, sitting before his painted landscape in contemplative immersion, gets up and enters its space. Benjamin references this story on several occasions in his writing, most notably in the work of Art in the Age of Its Technological Reproducibility, the 36 version, where the painter's entry into pictorial space figures the unanalytical spectatorship promoted by the auratic art of painting. In Benjamin's reading, the Chinese legend illustrates the immersive contemplation elicited by painting rather than Benjamin's preferred analytical attitude, an attitude generated by the mass medium of film. In surprising contradistinction, Siegfried Krakauer's theory of film suggests that the things of the world that appear in film images resonate multiple meanings and psychological correspondences, creating a maze, as he calls it, through which the spectator wanders towards the thing as if in a dream, dissolving the spectator into the substance of these objects. In fact, Krakauer writes that the film spectator drifts into the things of the world recorded by film images, and I quote, much like the Chinese painter who, longing for the peace of a landscape he had created, moved into it and walked toward the faraway mountains suggested by his brushstrokes and disappeared in them, never to be seen again. Alluding to, but not citing, Walter Benjamin by way of this legend, Krakauer redirects the force of Benjamin's reference to it. For Krakauer, in contradistinction to Benjamin, the relation between the things of the world and film and their spectator is one of mutual permeability, a phenomenological dialogue of the affects. Interestingly, Krakauer sees immersion as a response to the images of film, not to the auratic images of painting. Wu Daozi's entry into his painting functions as a parable of realism for Krakauer, for whom the painter's realist drive is for fusion with the images of his painting. Krakauer's emphasis on the realism, or call it illusionism, of Wu Daozi's murals is the more conventional way of reading the parable of the Chinese painter, but for Krakauer, immersion hinges on the question of phenomenological experience, on a dialogue with the things of the world in art. It is Walter Benjamin who gives immersion a negative political spin. In a recent essay, Zhang Cao takes up the provenance of Wu Daozi's story with respect to Benjamin's appropriation of it. In Chinese history, this painter is noted for his murals in Buddhist and Taoist temples, murals so true to life that animals depicted in them seem to move, a trope of realism. Cao pursues the tale of Wu Daozi through the work of German art historian Otto Fischer, who referred to Wu's art as Kunst der Versenkung, an art of immersion, ultimately tracing the story to Tachibana Morikuni, the 19th century Japanese woodcut artist and translator of earlier Chinese writings on painting. Cao's point is that Benjamin may actually not have read about the Chinese painter at all, but rather learned about the legend from one of Morikuni's woodcuts, with the attendant irony that a mass-produced woodcut would then have been the impetus for Benjamin's remarks concerning painting's auratic pull. The most prominent contemporary theorist of immersion is the art historian Michael Fried, who is clearly influenced by Krakauer. Like Krakauer, Fried reads the central expression of Gustave Courbet's immersive drive in the painter's figured corporeal entry into his paintings within the context of realism. Fried's interest in corporeality extends, like Krakauer's, to the materiality of the medium. He praises Courbet's gesture of figuratively entering his paintings as realism's appropriate strategy for denying the place of the painter-beholder before his work. Fried reads the strategy of entering the painting as Courbet's pictorial and ontological obsession. In all of our examples, there is a fascination with a figured continuity between a work of art, a painting, and the real, the world, a continuity that promotes spectatorial immersion in the painterly space. Image space and body space are figured as coextensive. How does this strategy play out in film? I'd like to approach this question by way of films about Vincent van Gogh, which so often resort to immersive strategies to address his work. Griselda Pollock is right to say that Van Gogh is a brand identity and that he is the paradigm for the suffering modern artist in humanist discourse. But there is more. Perhaps John Berger gets it right when he writes that Van Gogh's compulsion was, I quote, to bring the two acts of production, that of the canvas and that of the reality depicted, ever closer and closer, and that Van Gogh's desire was to approach and approach and approach. Repeatedly, filmmakers who address Van Gogh's work acknowledge the painter's immersive drive in their filmic approximations of it. Vincente Minnelli's Lust for Life, 1956, reconstructs Van Gogh's paintings as sets in which the Vincent character is contained. At one point in the film, the camera shoots Kirk Douglas against one of Vincent's paintings as though it were the diegetic landscape. Then there's the dissolve from a close-up of starlight over the Rhone that imposes Van Gogh brushstrokes over the filmic figure of Kirk Douglas. Here the conceit is that Vincent van Gogh paints over Vincente Minnelli's filmic images. Now, this is going to work out. Do I press it again to get the... No. How do I get the... Oh, here. I get the moving... Yes. So, okay. Thank you. I'm actually not sure that this totally works. And consider the scene in which, when a window is opened onto branches covered with peach blossoms, with the camera traveling over photographic and painterly landscapes alike. These intermedial techniques figure an exchange of sorts, which for Minnelli may well be an erotic exchange, but in any case figures the unity of the respective arts and artists, not their Brechtian dissonance. As Scott Buchanan puts it, by the time Van Gogh collapses in the cafe, the artist has come to inhabit his paintings. The spectator of Lust for Life is similarly swallowed up, plunged into the film's images, and not least by the immersive propensities of CinemaScope. Consider, too, Robert Altman's Vincent and Theo, 1990, where the trope of entering the painting is explicitly formulated. Here it is Vincent's brother Theo, who muses about his wish to enter a painting, describing this desire in conversation with a Parisian prostitute. There is something erotic in Theo's discourse, which is about a state of being hermetically sealed in an atemporal space in which Theo says he wishes to linger forever. This is a quote, "If I could just walk into the painting, if I could just stay there forever," he says, wishing for a place outside time and history. There follows an abrupt cut in a scene in which Vincent, his female companion, and her little girl are visiting a panorama. Not that we recognize the seacoast landscape as a painted panorama immediately. At first glance, it seems a photographic image of the seashore. For this sequence, Altman shot the panorama at Scheveningen, which Van Gogh did in fact visit and which still exists today. Here objects, the realia, camouflage the join between painted scene and the viewing platform of the panorama. In Altman's film, the panorama is realistic enough to fool the child who proceeds to relieve herself on the sand that fills this intermediate space. To what end does Altman include the sequence in his film, if not to point with some insistence to a spectatorial obsession, perhaps his own, with being in the picture? The sequence also focuses the mediatic issue of film's hypertextuality, its oscillation between realism and artifice. Now we come to the Van Gogh film that images this obsession most dramatically. I refer to two episodes in Akira Kurosawa's Dreams, 1990, which the filmmaker says were inspired by his own dreams. In these episodes, a young painting student wearing Kurosawa's signature hat is lost in the contemplation of Van Gogh's paintings, only to become literally immersed in them. By the way, visual effects for this film were created by George Lucas, and Martin Scorsese actually plays Van Gogh, which is very amusing. Stephen Prince suggests that the theme of immersion in this film points to the career in painting the filmmaker gave up, and that the student's literal immersion in these image spaces signifies the way in which Kurosawa might have been trapped in the forms of others had he remained a painter. It is also probable that the legend of Wu Dao-Ci, the painter who enters his painting, is at play here. Tachibana Morikuni's woodcuts and his translation of the story of Wu Dao-Ci would have been familiar to Kurosawa, a one-time student of painting. What is notable about the film's images of Van Gogh's work through which the young painter makes his way is their viscosity, the thick impasto of the paint that brings the brushstrokes into relief. These images are an extreme close-up, immersing character and spectator alike. Here, the materiality of paint is at issue. Film is a flat medium. Images on a screen can only figure texture, whereas paint is material, its application inscribed with the artist's facture. It may be that this is the aspect of Van Gogh's technique that inspires filmmakers to read his work as immersive. The Japanese art student of Kurosawa's film pursues Van Gogh through several landscapes, ending with wheat field with crows, said to be the last painting the artist completed. But at the end of this vignette, the art student extricates himself from the paintings in which he has been entrapped, rejects immersion, picks up his painting materials, and leaves the museum. The implication is that he will henceforth pursue another art form. Other films featuring Van Gogh make use of his work in different but similarly over-the-top ways. Of these, I'll just briefly mention Dorota Kobiela and Hugh Welshman's Loving Vincent, 2017, an animated film which consists of more than 65,000 oil paintings. Each frame of the film is hand-painted. Here, Van Gogh's paintings become film images that simulate the movement produced by editing procedures. The insistence on the film's painted images as constituting a world is a trope of realism, and its strategies can be understood as immersive in the sense that the film posits a living reality similar to our own, one that might be entered. Interestingly, none of the above-mentioned films resorts to tableau vivant to explore immersion. Perhaps this is because while tableau vivant is a literally immersive practice for those who participate in it, for the spectator, its impact treads the narrow line between art and the real. But tableau vivant is one of the important ways of being in the picture. So I'll conclude with a few remarks about Agnes Varda's The Gleaners and I, 2000, a rather complex film to which I cannot do justice here. I will only be focusing on its tableau vivant, though I've written about it. Among other representations of women in fields, Varda's film references Jules Breton's La Glaneuse, a painting she visits in the Arras Museum of Fine Art. When Varda stages a tableau vivant of La Glaneuse, it is not simply an amusing way of suggesting her identification with the female gleaner of Breton's painting. Standing next to the canvas, Varda, in a held pose, speaks complexly of the relation of painting to the real world by performing this figured merger with the painted subject.
L'autre glaneuse, celle du titre de ce documentaire, c'est moi. Je laisse volontiers tomber les épis de blé pour prendre la caméra.
In Varda's tableau, we find the embodiedness, the making real, privileged by realism, alongside an antithetical modernist theatricality expressed in her bold frontal look out. This frontal look is both a feature of the documentary genre, The Gleaners and I is an essay film that has pronounced documentary concerns, and a way of acknowledging the artifice of the filmic medium. In other words, the tableau performs a both-and that allows it to evoke realism and yet to stand outside and against it in a gesture typical of modernism. Varda's tableau vivant is in every way a performance. She visibly enjoys the ironic tension between the heroic stance and stature of Breton's glaneuse and her own diminutive stature, her unheroic figure that nevertheless assumes the heroic attitude of the painted one. The theatricality of Varda's look out prevents spectatorial immersion in the film's images. Her tableau stresses dissonance rather than immersion. Indeed, the digital camera with which The Gleaners and I saw it is shot contributes to the film's dissonant textuality. This dematerializing medium is seen over and against Varda's many gestures toward materiality, producing a textuality in a state of tension. Echoed formally by the many fragments and disparate narratives of which the film is composed, in juxtaposition with the subjective associative editing that promotes unity, the tension between fragment and whole remains suspended. Immersion is not emancipatory. That is the province of an analytical attitude before the object filmed, as Walter Benjamin suggests. By stressing the tableau's dissonance, Varda accommodates an analytical form to her feminist stance, creating a picture that oscillates between modalities, one we can never enter.